This Choircast podcast is brought to you by The Subversive Soul. Has anyone ever told you that your soul is essentially whole? How about singular, embodied, and wild? Did they teach you how to live from your soul in a way that rearranges your guts and sets you on a path toward wholeness? That's exactly what this book delivers. The Subversive Soul by Phyllis Mathis is available now on Amazon.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney and Bethany Shea.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat Turney. I'm here with my brother John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
We should also take a moment of silence for our missing third co-host, Bethany. Yeah. Moment of silence.
That's enough. Out doing something fun, I'm sure.
Oh, sometimes it's fun, and sometimes it's like she's shaming us with the goodness she does in the world.
Right.
That bothers me no end. She's out because she's down in Mexico building houses for people, and I'm like, oh, look at you. I'm just on a cruise or something. When I'm out, I'm very selfish, and she is very selfless. But Bethany, you are missed. We'll see you next time when you're back. But she also brings balance to the force. I noticed that when she's not here, there's an eruditeness that she's erudite, and John and I are none of those things. But we're here today. This is the podcast that we have lovingly called "This Is Not Church," because if it was church, you would have left by now. And since Bethany's not here, there'd be no one to talk you out of it. John and I'd be like, absolutely, meet in the parking lot, crack a Molson. No Molsons. We've already talked. We'll talk about bad Canadian beer later. But as always, we have a guest. Let's get to that. And you've heard enough of my yammering already. We have with us today Paul Bramadat. He's the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria and the co-editor of Religion at the Edge, Nature, Spirituality, and Secularity in the Pacific Northwest. He practices and teaches Ashtanga yoga. His latest book is called Yogalands, In Search of Practice on the Mat and the World. And without any further ado, welcome to the podcast. How are you, Paul?
I'm great. Good to see you guys.
And we're so glad to have you. I'm already just intrigued with the subject matter. I think I can speak for John, at least in this regard. I don't know enough about these kinds of things, having been raised as a strictly Western evangelical Christian and been told that all of that stuff you're about to talk about is evil and witchcraft. Maybe it could be forgiven that we don't know a ton. So I love the point of saying that is I always really, really like to hear and learn about things I don't know enough about. And I think that's the point of being here, is to find out more about things we don't know about and gosh darn it, be willing to admit when you don't know. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say this afternoon or this evening. Whenever you guys listen, I should stop putting times on these things because you might be in your car right now and it might be midnight. Who knows when people are listening?
Yeah, really.
But so whatever time you do. But if you would just maybe by way of introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe a little about your spiritual background. Anything you want to share would be fantastic.
Sure. Right. So I'm a religious studies professor by trade. So religious studies is like a field. So some of us are historians, some of us are anthropologists, some of us are literary scholars. I'm really more in the anthropologist, cast. And I've been working as a professor for about 25 years. And 27 years, I guess, and been running the research center at the University of Victoria for the last 17 years. I just finished my stint there in July. And I work on anytime religion basically makes it into the public arena. So anytime you might have an argument about religion at Thanksgiving or at Christmas or in the shopping mall, that topic of the argument is kind of my problem. So anytime religion is entering the public arena. And you mentioned the evangelical thing. So my first book actually was called The Church on the World's Turf.
Wow.
It was looking at a very conservative evangelical group at a secular university to try to figure out how that worked. And so, because that was one of these kind of peculiar things, kind of counterintuitive, that you'd have this super conservative religious group at a super secular campus.
Yeah.
So, that's the kind of thing that might make it into a potluck conversation or an argument with your weird uncle. And yoga, and the other book you mentioned was Religion at the Edge, which is about how weird the Cascadia bioregion is, so Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, and that's the kind of thing that might also make it onto the docket of a weird uncle's rant at a Thanksgiving dinner. So we did a book about that. And yoga is the most recent book. It's called Yogalands, and I just published it a couple months ago. And it grows out of my own practice. I'm a pretty serious yoga practitioner and a yoga teacher. But now I'm also kind of a professor of yoga studies, I guess you could say. And so my religious upbringing was Unitarian. So I was raised super left, liberal, post-Christian Unitarian. And then, which is really kind of hard to backslide from,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So, but I had kind of drifted away from that. And then I had a pretty serious arthritis episode, I guess you could say, when I was in my mid-40s. And I was basically told, my life from now on is going to be medication and surgery. Like I was pretty much finished doing anything with my knees for the rest of my life. And I said to the doctor, like, okay, really? What about Pilates or acupuncture, massage, yoga? I kind of just listed all the complementary things. And he kind of rolled his eyes and said, well, sure, whatever. You can do that stuff, but basically surgery and anti-inflammatories, that's your life from now on. Because the x-rays were pretty daunting, he said. Anyway, long story short, a friend of mine suggested trying yoga. So I tried it. I didn't really want to do it. Like I kind of went in grumbling under my breath. But I went in and it really fundamentally changed my life. It was a kind of an Amazing Grace kind of story for sure. Or, Road to Damascus almost kind of story, where I really was very suspicious of what I was going to find in a yoga studio. I was in my mid-40s, so my brain was already pretty well formed with all my prejudices and biases about white people or white passing people taking up Asian practices, and also all the weird, very often toxic beauty myths that you see in a yoga studio. So I was already pretty well set and armed against that. And I went in, I limped in, I should say, because I was in a tremendous amount of pain. And really within, 3 weeks or so, I could walk again. And then I just started, I started getting curious and scratching the surface. And I discovered that underneath this physical practice that allowed me to walk with some comfort was this other kind of spiritual set of practices that I got very curious about. And because I was a Unitarian, I wasn't sinning, it wasn't like I was sinning God or even disappointing. My mother was a minister. It's not like I was, making anybody angry by investigating this. And I'm half Indian, I should say. My father was Indo-Trinidadian. And so in some sense, there was a way in which taking up a yoga practice was kind of like coming home.
Yeah.
So that was lovely. So that's where I'm at.
Wow. It's such an interesting thing because, again, in the West, and again, in our specific version of the West, most oftentimes I notice that things like yoga are just caricaturized, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't know. And so we have these sort of two-dimensional caricatures of what it means to do any of this. And of course, it's different. So that means we should be afraid.
Yeah.
And I've heard some of the most, I'm sure you have too, the most ludicrous stuff come out of people's mouths, It's a gateway to opening your life to demons, which, for Unitarian demons, whatever.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah, we ain't scared of no metaphors. Get out of here with your metaphors. But I grew up and I spent, into my 20s and 30s in a religious system that literalized all of that.
Yeah.
Demons were a for real thing. We went to battle.
Yeah.
With things in heavenly places. And so yoga was like persona non grata because it was a gateway into that. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, except just to explain again that I don't know much about it. So I'm anxious for some more insight. But were those things that maybe even though you weren't raised in a religious culture like that, but just sort of in the American, well, I guess not American, you were in Canada, but I know there are segments of Canada that also have some ultra religious, mindsets as well. Is that something that even having some exposure to, you had to overcome when you went into that place?
Yeah, I live on the west coast of Canada, which is the Canada of Canada. It's the farthest left granola kind of part of Canada. We do have a kind of a little Bible belt in British Columbia, but it's pretty little. And so instead of coming up against people thinking that this is going to open the door to demons and possession and so forth, what I had to deal with is the caricatures of the trivial nature of yoga and the kind of cultural appropriation. And so, when I would tell my cool urban cosmopolitan academic friends that I was both a practitioner and a scholar of yoga, they would work really hard not to roll their eyes, right? Because they knew that that's super impolite to do that. when someone tells you about something that's important to them that they're writing a book on. But you could just see they were working super hard not to say, wow, you seemed like such a smart guy, and now you're doing this weird thing. So that was the kind of caricatures and exaggerations I had to deal with. And it's off-putting, because if I told somebody I was working on Anglican theology, or I was working on, the temple construction in ancient Israel, they'd all say, oh, yeah, totally, that makes sense. But if I said yoga, they came, you could just feel like I had pushed a button, and all kinds of caricatures from popular culture. Like, in some sense, it's not their fault. Popular culture, religion gives them all kinds of caricatures, and they just slot that in. And so I sometimes say to people, they say, hey, Paul, what's your new book on? And I say, it's on yoga. And they'll be like trying to suppress a smirk. And I say, well, what I really study is what just happened in your head when I said I'm studying and practicing yoga. Because I said, what's happening in your head is all this stuff from popular culture rushes forward into the front of your imagination. And my job, in some sense, is to get behind that and say, hey, where did that come from? Isn't that interesting? Some of it got there for good reason, like some of the crazy ideas about body dysmorphia and so forth. Some of the cultural appropriation ideas. So some of these ideas got there for good reason. So I'm not trying to deny that. But, when it's such a popular practice, I mean, if you look at it, the practice in North America, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it's also a practice that a very, very large portion of people in North America, especially the more cosmopolitan urban spaces, embrace, and for both physical as well as sort of psycho-spiritual reasons. And so when you see that, it feels to me like it's a good idea to develop a posture of openness and curiosity about what people are devoting their lives and their dollars to. And so in some sense, I would try to get beyond the smirk that people would give me and say, hey, look, there's something else going on here. Maybe we can hold some space or create some curiosity about what people are up to.
Did you find, as you're looking into this and you look into like the cultural appropriation of yoga, that you found people who maybe got into it with more of a lighter version of it, but then as they got into it would dig deeper and deeper?
Yeah. No, that's really good, John. That is exactly what I found, is that people would often go, almost everybody I talked to. So I did what we would call ethnographic research. So I went and visited 7 cities in North America. I did a big international survey. I interviewed 160 people at focus groups as well as direct interviews. And I went to 65 different classes. And then I have my own practice, which is like about 15 years old. And so everybody I talked to said they almost all started with a physical complaint. I had a bad back, or I was overweight, or I couldn't sleep properly, or in my case, my arthritis, like some kind of physical thing drew them in there. And then they usually said, I figured out how to deal with my bad back and my sleeping and my obesity or whatever, or my addiction. Addiction was a very common thing that drove people in. And then they said, I stuck around because I found something else was going on there. Maybe I needed community as well, and I didn't expect that. Maybe I needed a kind of a spiritual discipline, and I didn't expect that. Or maybe I needed some kind of set of some kind of stories for the way the universe works, and I didn't go in there looking for that. I went in there to fix my knees or my back or my terrible shoulders from all the typing I do, and I found a different thing.
Well, it seems to me too, and again, just my impression is that one of the things you learn from this sort of practice is that physical ailments often have spiritual or emotional undertones, right? Does that make sense? I mean, so to me, it would make a lot of sense that somebody might come in with a symptom and say, well, yeah. And then as you would with any doctor for that matter, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. This is the pain I'm experiencing. Let's get to the root of it. Let's not just, put a cream on the rash. Let's figure out why you're breaking out. It's so much though. Tell me if you think this is a stretch, but I think so much of what we're experiencing in the West, and I would lump us all in this to some degree, is a disconnection of mind body. We are so busy treating the surface area stuff and neglecting. And I would say this is a story of Christianity in large part, and why I've fallen away from most of it is that it's focused almost exclusively on the external. Let's get your behavior in line. Let's get your appearance in line. Let's make sure you do. And there's all kinds of things going on under the surface. How does this practice of yoga maybe potentially address those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay. Anyway,
it's totally an excellent question. I mean, I think one of the real challenges is, and you mentioned, people will go in to see a doctor, for example, with the various complaints about sleep or obesity or bad knees or whatever the thing is. And the doctor's got certain tools in his or her toolkit, right, to figure out what's going on. But they're also under the pressure of a certain kind of economic system to move people through as quickly as possible. So they don't really have time to say, hey, you keep coming in with this bad back business and the I can't sleep business and the I'm depressed business. And the reality is, you're in the American context, your insurance company doesn't cover more than one visit or two visits, and you're going to start having to pay significant out-of-pocket fees. Or in the Canadian case, we don't have the time. There aren't enough practitioners to deal with like long-term treatment for your depression or your bad back. So they just want them kind of to be managing the kind of surface symptoms. And, unless you get good psychiatric care or good counseling care, it's going to be hard to get at some of the underlying stuff. But the benefit of a yoga practice, especially if you do it in a regular way within a community, within a kind of a consistent, coherent set of principles about where suffering comes from, how to deal with suffering on an immediate, like a surface level, and then how to deal with the causes of suffering, which I think is what many good yoga spaces will do. If you stay there and you kind of are part of the broader conversation about the human condition, you'll see they have a kind of a diagnosis of like, here's where your suffering comes from. And they might even break it down. If you're having suffering around addiction or having suffering around sleeping or whatever it is, here are the other under the surface dynamics that might be expressing themselves in physical suffering. And they might have practices for how to deal with that, whether it's breathing practices or movement practices or meditation practices for dealing with the deeper dynamics that are at work. And that's one thing I appreciate about the practice I do, which is a kind of a fairly traditional yoga practice, is it gives me kind of a whole account of like what's happening in my body and what techniques, breathing, movement, concentration techniques I can use to alleviate both the superficial pain, like kind of the immediate pain, but more importantly, kind of calm the mind such that I don't have to, it's one thing to have pain and relieve the pain, but the suffering is the suffering and the sources of the suffering are much deeper. And, so in some ways, the success of these kind of complementary or alternative modalities, it's a kind of an indictment of the broader society that gives us a very particular kind of biomedical model for how to deal with pain and suffering, right? Whether it's American or Canadian. There are all kinds of problems with it. Mostly the problems are economic and political. And these treatment modalities, like yoga and meditation and these kinds of alternative groups, give you kind of like a longer timeline and a bigger story for dealing with where your suffering comes from and how you might address it. Of course, you have to have the kind of income that gets you access to these things. So it's not for everybody, right? They're not free. They can't be free. But once you kind of are able to get into one of these spaces, you get kind of a different story about the human condition and your human condition.
I'm fascinated by it. I have been for some time. I'm just hearing you talk right now, and I'm even more fascinated. But what strikes me also is that you could go in. Here's what, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you could even go in to something like learning about yoga, and at least at first, maybe not have the best of intentions. Like, I have, or maybe not. Maybe that's probably the wrong way to put that. But say, hey, well, I really am here just for these superficial reasons, which are important. I don't want to downplay the importance of pain. Obviously, if you're in pain, I'm looking for anything to alleviate that pain. But that if that's what you need, you can get that. And if you want to access something else on a different level, that's eventually there as well for you, and you can go deeper. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. At the end of every interview, I asked, when I was interviewing a teacher, I said, hey, I want to give you kind of a case, a kind of a hypothetical scenario. Let's imagine you're my teacher, and I came into you with a bad back or a stiff neck or whatever it is. And you're, 5 years later, I'm just moving from one body part to another. Bad back, obesity, sleeping problems, depression. I'm moving from one physical problem to another. And that's 5 years in, and that's all I care about. I'm just moving around my body, checking boxes and fixing pain, like little niggly pains. And I said, if I was your student, and you noticed that 5 or 10 years later, I was still doing these physical problems, what would you think? Would you feel like you had failed me somehow by not introducing me to the bigger, the sort of broader, deeper ambitions of a yoga practice? And, most of them said, look, we just take people where they're at. If they come in and they just want to move around and fix different bits and pieces of their body, that's fine. We'll do that. And then another roughly, about 10% of people said, well, look, if someone was that kind of a person and they were just interested in their body bits and fixing their body bits, they wouldn't stick with me anyway, because I start talking about the deeper meanings and deeper methods right away. And then there was another small chunk of people who said, if you said that to me, Paul, if you were that imaginary student, I wouldn't believe you. I would think that even though you're fixing your knees and your back and then you're sleeping and then your obesity or whatever, that actually you may not know it, but it's affecting you at a deeper level. I thought was, in some sense, they rejected the hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought that was a pretty cool answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I keep coming back to this thought, though, that especially within the West, that are there yoga practitioners or yoga classes, I guess I would call it, that don't really fit that mold. They are westernized, and so they don't teach more of the spiritual side of it. And does that do harm to the overarching idea of yoga?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, like within the Christian tradition, there are some Christian communities that really lean into the beautiful music and the kind of elevation of the spirit that you get from kind of a trance-like meditative singing experience. And there are others that lean into heavy-duty theology right away, and they're parsing the text and they're making sure you're kind of embedded within a complex systematic theology. And so, every tradition has every Christian tradition, for example, has its kind of emphasis and its kind of feeling. And some traditions, of course, are very big on smells and bells. And I would say there are some yoga studios that hardly ever talk about the more than physical elements of yoga. Like if you go to the YMCA or, some strip mall, and there's a kind of hole in the wall yoga studio, often they know that their market is mostly people who are trying to fix parts of their body, right? Or a kind of a deeply embodied physical or psychological problem like depression or anxiety. And so they're not like their clients, as it were, are not coming there looking for spirituality, they think. But if you develop a longer term relationship with almost any yoga teacher, they're going to want to direct your attention. After you kind of manage the physical stuff, they want to direct you, they want to embed that practice within some larger set of questions or set of understandings about the way the world works. So I don't know that if a teacher or a yoga studio is really focused on just bodily results or bodily experiences, I don't think that's doing any harm, because I think people come to these practices because they're in crisis usually, or because they're pursuing vanity, right? They want to look better in their bathing suit or whatever. That's, in my view, that's not for me to judge if that's good or bad. I think, and I'm not sure we can talk about it doing damage. Like doing damage to what? I mean, I think a person comes to these things because they're usually suffering or curious or unhappy with something in their world. And if they find some kind of home or, sense of satisfaction, I'm good with that. And I do hope, of course, that they stick around and they ask deeper questions. But I would hope the same thing for a person who entered a Christian church and really what they're looking for is a wife or a husband, right? Or they're looking for good business connections. Like that's a thing, right? That's a thing.
Absolutely.
So, but do I think that they're damaging the tradition? If they stick around there and they're only looking for business connections 10 years later and they haven't paid any attention to gospel messages, they haven't paid any attention to human suffering or building, schools in Nicaragua or whatever, they haven't paid any attention to the other things a church might do, I would think, again, I'm not a Christian, so I don't have a horse in the race, but I would think that's kind of a bit of a bummer. All you're doing is looking for business connections. But again, people have their own kind of paths to walk. And yeah. So
no, in my experience, I was a pastor for many years and I saw that happen all the time. I would say to you the same thing that the 5% of your respondents said, which was, well, if that's what they came to my church looking for, they wouldn't have stayed very long.
Right.
We didn't attract that many wealthy people anyway. And I think they would have gotten discouraged or frustrated fairly quickly. And I'm like you, I would have also said, and so what? I can't imagine the damage they did. If they did damage to always to themselves, they shortchanged themselves on potential for going deeper in some areas and some relationships and learning. I think in this respect, there's a lot of parallel between all religious traditions. You can go into them superficially, or you can decide to go deeper and find the deeper meaning. I don't think there's a religion on earth that does not have something valuable to add, along with a whole lot of bullshit. But you can find, within Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism, and I can find all kinds of things to resonate with and go, okay, that's not my tradition. But speaking of, so let me ask you this then. You said you're not a Christian. Are you, because of your yoga practice, have you delved more into Hinduism, or is your religious practice yoga? And that sounds like an ignorant question, even as I say it, but.
No, it's not ignorant. No, it's a totally appropriate question. I guess I would say I'm a yogatarian, I mean,
Gotcha.
I've got this sort of like deeply liberal, curious, cosmopolitan framework for thinking about the world, which is basically Unitarian, very liberal and non-creedal and suspicious of structures and egalitarian and all that. That's basically how it was in my mother's milk, almost literally. But yoga is my set of practices, and the philosophical account of the universe and suffering that I get through, especially Patanjali's yoga, which is like about a couple thousand years old. Let's say this philosophical system, that account of reality is the account of reality that makes most sense to me in terms of where does suffering come from, and how do we account for transcendence, or and what is the self, and so forth. So those things make most sense to me.
No, it reminds me of what we've said many times about Buddhism, for example, where I know many Christians who are Christian and maybe in doctrine and theology, but in practice they're very Buddhist, because for them there's no contradiction in those things at all. The practice of Buddhism dovetails very nicely with their experiences out of Christianity. We had a guest on, and I cannot remember her name, but she was Hindu, and she said the same thing about that. She was raised Hindu and Christian, and she grew up in a place where she saw no issue with the practices of her given religions. I have a question though. So would then, and again, I'm coming down to these binary terms, and I apologize. I don't really have another mechanism for this, but so would your embrace of yoga, would that include a theistic outlook, or is there a theism involved in there, or is this pretty much just spiritual in that sense of hey, I'm going to go deeper into myself and find these connections with other people this way, versus some sort of external source of objective truth and morals and everything?
Yeah, no, there's no reason to apologize for the theism or the binaries, because actually that's just sort of built into the way we talk about religion and spirituality, right? So, I mean, I'm not theistic. It's very difficult for me to think about a creator or a personal entity that I have some kind of relationship with.
Same, I got you.
I have a more of a sense that the Yoga Sutras, which is this kind of classical articulation of yoga philosophy, lays out a view of the world and most specifically the self that can be an effective kind of model or paradigm or metaphor or set of symbols to help you think about how you exist in the world and why you're suffering as you're suffering. So yeah, I'm not theistic, but it's funny how, most of us have been raised to think about religions as kind of different teams in the same league. Right. So that you can't play on more than one team in the same soccer league or hockey league or football league. And so people ask you these questions like, well, what team do you play on in this league called religion? And, those of us who study religion and who see this as a kind of an expression of a set of social and intellectual processes don't I can't really answer that question. I mean, except to say that this is what it does in my life, is it helps me make sense of my suffering. It helps me make sense of the things in my imagination that hold me back. It helps me make sense of the relationship between my body, my mind, and the world around me.
No, I think that's beautiful. I think I'm in the same boat, by the way. I'm the farther down the rabbit hole I go, the less convinced I am.
That must have made it awkward. Did you still have this perspective when you were a pastor? Because that must have made things pretty awkward.
I don't recommend it. For the last year that I was, my church experience is long and fairly storied. My last ditch effort to stay was to leave the church I was in and plant my own, where I could be a bit of a heretic and maybe hopefully attract some fellow like-minded heretics. And I did, a handful. I was accused of being a cult leader, although I was terrible at that because I never made any money, and no one really listened to me. So it was okay. If I was a cult leader, it was a fairly failed cult leader. But no, that was and I was deconstructing heavily at the time. At the time, I thought just from traditional religion, just from fundamentalist religion, what I found, and I think what a lot of people in my position have found, is that once you begin that unraveling, you don't really have a choice where the unraveling stops.
Right.
Unless you want to artificially just pump the brakes and say, nope, I will live in this cognitive dissonance here because this is where somehow I'm comfortable. So I went, I don't even know what I am now. I know that I have difficulties with any of the concepts that I was raised with of God as an external, separate entity with a mind that somehow cares who I sleep with. That seems, the God that gets involved in very trivial things in our lives, but doesn't give a shit about the suffering of most people.
Yeah.
Who can sit idly by with starvation and war, but doesn't want me to eat shellfish. I have an issue. I have an issue with that level.
Sure,
so I don't know. So that's an easy thing for me to reject. However, I can unload. I have not been able to fully unload a sense that there are deeper connections that we make as human beings to one another, and so community still is very important to me. I noticed a couple of times the terms of harm came up in your book. And
well, but you know what's really interesting about your reflections just now, and that was that the one of the titles that the book was going to have before we gave it the title Yogalands was Religion for Adults.
Yeah,
and in some sense, what this book is about is how you think dispassionately about something that you love passionately.
Yeah, exactly.
So, whether you're a Christian or you're a yoga practitioner or you're just a member of a family, and then someone says, hey, let's look really closely at Christianity or your family structure or this thing called yoga, whatever this thing is that you love as a child. You're raised to love this thing, your religion, your nation, your family, your yoga practice. And then someone like me comes along who's trained to get people to think about these things critically, historically, sociologically, anthropologically, whatever. And they say, hey, John and Nat, let's think about this thing called America, or let's think about this thing called the tourneys, whatever it is, whatever the thing you love is, but you love it as a child. And then someone says, hey, I wonder if your love of this thing can handle its consideration as an adult, right? And so can you still love America, Christianity, yoga, the tourney family, whatever it might be? Can you still love that when you look at it closely and dispassionately? In some sense, the book is about taking readers into a dispassionate assessment of this thing called yoga. And look, when you look at it dispassionately, you find sexual abuse, you find body dysmorphia, you find a particular kind of capitalism and cultural appropriation. So you find all that stuff. It's just like if we looked at the Turney family and the history of that, or the history of America.
Please don't.
No, it's not. Yeah, there's going to be like horse thieves and horse thieves and slave owners, and this is all just normal human stuff. There's going to be all that stuff down there way back 100, 300 years ago. So when we do that, it breaks your heart a little bit, right? To look closely at what's happening to America, to look closely what's happened to especially evangelical Christianity, or what's even happened to yoga after the Me Too movement was like it was like shining a super bright light on yoga and other things. And so that's going to break your heart when you see some of the damage, some of the harm that's been done within these contexts. And one strategy is to say, well, that wasn't real yoga, or those weren't the good Americans, or those weren't the good evangelicals. My evangelicals, my Americans, my fellow yoga practitioners are the good ones. It's like, okay, you can do that, but that's a strategy that says, I'm clean, they are dirty. And I kind of want in this book to be showing people that in some sense, we can all still own this thing called yoga or America or Canada. We can still all own these things, be in them, be committed to them as adults. And it's a richer a richer path. It's a richer way to be in your society, to be in your yoga practice, to be in your church, to be in your family. It's a richer way to do that. It takes some courage, and it's going to be pretty heartbreaking. But that's why the book was going to be called Yoga for Adults. But instead we went with Yogalands, because Yogalands is kind of imagining a kind of an imaginary space that people move through, whether they're practicing at home in their rec room, or they're going to a big hot yoga studio, in a big urban center, or they go to a yoga retreat in India or whatever. They're still in some space mentally in the same, they're traveling in different parts of the same country, you could say, of Yogaland. And I'm trying to get people to sort of imagine that that's that country, just like Slovenia and, Ireland have their own particular ways of dealing with food and money and cab driving and traffic signals. Everything's a little bit different in every place you go. And Yogalands, if you imagine it as a kind of a country, has its own kind of unique set of weirdnesses. And if you're a traveler, like if you travel to Slovenia or to Hungary or to Morocco, you bump into all these weirdnesses. Oh, I don't serve food like that. I don't, why do people treat each other like that in cabs? But the longer you stay there, you see, okay, that's just the way they do things there. And you try to find some way to still love it, but as an adult.
No, I think that's a very, very interesting way to look at that. I like the title, but I could also see why you might have shied away from it.
Yeah. Because you had to say, I had to give all this explanation before people would understand what meant by adults.
Yeah. I'm like, oh, but that being said, it resonates. It really does, because as I examine the faith of my childhood and adulthood, what I see is, in order to stay, if I wanted to stay where I was, and trust me, there was tons of temptation to do so. There was a lot to lose by walking away, but I would have had to stay a child. And now that you say it like that, now I'm like, yeah, 100%. Because the only way to stay is to pretty much close your eyes real tight, pretend you don't see stuff, put your fingers in your ears and say, I can't hear you. And very much, and unfortunately, what's baked into the Christian religion is that's promulgated as something positive, because you take the words of Jesus, it says, unless you come to me as a little child. So we are like, this childlike faith is something we aspire to. It's got its own defeater built into it. Like, okay, well, we're not encouraged to grow up. We got perpetual sort of Peter Pan syndrome when it comes to being thoughtful about the things we do. But it makes it very, very hard to reckon with the things that have been done, as you said, in the name of these religions, and hold people to account for the harm they've caused. Because we just don't, because to admit that, at least in some people's minds, is to admit a bigger problem with the religion, and the house of cards starts to crumble.
Yeah. And I'm sure when you, you as an intellectually oriented pastor, trying to encourage the people in your congregation to think critically about this or that text, or this or that practice, or this or that approach.
Anything that ever came out of my mouth.
Yeah.
Think about what I just said.
Yeah. And criticize
it. If you have, let's argue about it. Let's fight about it. Let's, I got really tired. That's probably one of the final straws for me, was this tendency for people to put themselves in pulpits and then set themselves up to not be questioned. And I'm like, and then it turned out most of them I'll just say that most of them didn't know anything.
Yeah.
And because they were so insecure about their own knowledge, that's why they projected all of that. Because
but they had sort of, I guess, I don't know the community you're talking about directly, although I know that.
Yeah, but you know the absolutely
Christian phenomenon for sure from my first book. But the resistance to doing that, because they were raised on a very beautiful, warm, enveloping form of Christianity that answered all kinds of questions for them, which I get. And so you come along, you start threatening that.
Yeah.
Saying, well, where exactly in the Bible does it say that two men can't be married?
Yeah.
Show me exactly, and then they can't really do that.
Yeah.
And then you have a problem, right? Because some of the certainties on which they were raised become, create friction in their own imagination. And same thing in a yoga space when I say to people, hey, let's talk about sexuality or the sexual abuse scandals in the yoga world, or let's talk about the way it's often the case in a yoga studio that they'll say this tradition is 5,000 years old. Right? They'll say yoga is 5,000 years old. That's a super common thing to hear and to say. And I'll say, okay, well, what's the actual historical evidence of that? And it's pretty thin. I mean, practices have been practiced. The physical practices have been part of the South Asian tradition for sure. But the idea that what you see in a hot yoga studio or in the YMCA or whatever, that's been practiced like that for 5,000 years is just, I'm trying to say this softly because I'm Canadian and we're bred that way, right. But it's kind of nonsense, right? So when I would, be talking to some of my fellow practitioners even, and I would say, hey, this teacher or this book said it's 5,000-year-old long string, like an unbroken string all the way back to Shiva on the mountain, basically, all the way to you in Detroit or Halifax or New York or Winnipeg. And I say that, many of these practices and these sequences that many of us are used to if we go to yoga studios are actually not more than 100 years old. That they've been reconstituted, they've been strung together, a kind of a story has been told around them. And that's one of the I would say the myths in the rich sense of that word that is baked into the story of yoga in North America. And so again, since I don't really have a horse in the race and I'm not trying to become a cult leader, I simply say, where do you think these stories came from?
Yeah.
Like, where do you think the story, like what purpose is being served by telling students that this is 5,000 years old? And then you could ask a question in Christianity, what purpose is being served by telling somebody in Akron, Ohio, that the Bible forbids homosexuality, or whatever the claim might be? The Bible forbids sex before marriage or whatever. What additional social or cultural agenda is being served by saying that about Christianity, about yoga, about America, that America is a land of freedom? It's like, okay, well, you can absolutely say that. And I can see why Americans would love to hear that thing being said. And then if you say, and the culture was built by slaves, without slavery as a part of the culture, and in Canada, without kind of a cultural genocide of Indigenous people as part of our history, you don't really have a Canada.
Yeah.
It was part of subduing the society. So if you put both of those things, the love one might have of Canada, on the same table as saying, well, this is what we did to Indigenous people to control the land and make sure English or French was spoken everywhere. Now, can you as an adult have both of those things in the same head? And can we say that, okay, yoga is an ancient Indic tradition? And so you can say that. And then you can say at the same time, and most of the things you might practice in Cincinnati or in Winnipeg or Saskatoon are no more than 100 years old. That set of sequences, this way of thinking about the way the body works is about 100 years old, in some cases about 30 years old. So I think you can have both of those things in the same head, just in the same way that you can have in your same head that, my father was, let's say, he spanked me too much, but he was also a very loving man. That hurts to have that in the same head. But those two truths might be the case, not in my father's case, but this is a very common thing people have to deal with. My so-and-so was an alcoholic, but so-and-so loved her children more than life itself. Well, it hurts to have those things in the same head, but that's what it means to be an adult, is to have those things in your head at the same time.
Well, I mean, I'm having this reckoning myself. John might even be having them now with our adult children, where I'm having these conversations with my kids and trying to reckon with, ways in which I thought I was a really good parent, but also understanding that I failed.
Yeah.
And because they're all having kids now too. So now the conversations need to be had of letting them know, like, I understand I screwed some things up. I hope you understand that going forward, you can make better choices than I made here. Let's talk about those before you know what I'm saying?
That hurts though, eh?
It absolutely hurts because you have an idealized version of yourself. I have a fairly idealized version of my own childhood, and I know my parents were and are imperfect.
Yeah.
But all of that is the honesty required is what I think we're getting to, right? Is that there's a benefit to eyes wide open examination of these things and saying, yes, these are the good things. There's a whole lot of bad that comes along with it. I can see some of the positive of the last 30 to 50 to 100 years of medical science maybe coming alongside yoga and saying, hey, all of your spiritual practices, here's how we can actually plant them in the bedrock of some good science too. And now we know better how the body works in this way. Oh, look, this yoga practice actually reinforces that idea. And I could see those two things coming into play in some harmonious way. And I can also see them coming to loggerheads at some places. And then having to decide which one gives.
Yeah, because on social media, you'll hear people say like yoga is basically the solution to every physical ailment, right? Even though there's not evidence for lots of yoga interventions, and in some cases, yoga will be terrible for particular kinds of injuries. So you have lots of people on the internet selling yoga as a solution for everything. And the tricky thing though is, if so many people are coming to yoga or to church traumatized, right? Or even refugees to America coming to America as refugees, traumatized by something in their own country, or in the case of people who come to the yoga studio, something in their own life or something in their own family system. They come traumatized, they find something healing and wonderful and life-giving. And then you come along as the pastor, or I come along as a scholar of yoga, and I say, well, some of these things you're hearing at a yoga studio or in a church or from your politicians, some of them are kind of exaggerations. Some of them are straightforwardly incorrect or medically incorrect. And how do you not mess with that person's healing? Because that person, comes with a terrible trauma history, and yoga is in some ways helping them kind of heal that trauma. And then you come along, or I come along and say, hey, everything's way more complicated. And some of these medical claims that you're hearing about yoga are not actually, there's no support from evidence for that. But if it's making you feel better, stick with it, be curious, and don't resist the questions that might be arising in your mind. Same thing that you might want as a pastor in a church. When questions arise in the pulpits, you want people to say, hey, I don't know about that, or I can't find that in my Bible.
Yeah, exactly.
My translation says this.
Yeah. Well, and I found always the best answer was, yeah, I don't understand that either. Let's, there has to be a place where you become comfortable with a handful of I don't knows, and the older I get, the more I realize there's things, the less I think I know, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
It's sort of the opposite end of that Dunning-Kruger scale, where like really, really smart people don't consider themselves really smart, actually, because they're
right. And the cost.
Yeah. Well, the
cost of that is that you might keep your mouth shut, and that's a shame. Because there's something that really, really smart people who are also self-aware and self-critical have to give to the world.
Yeah,
and if you keep your mouth shut because you're worried about people turning on you, if you try to kind of critique their magical thinking or critique their kind of childlike approach to America or your family or the church or yoga, if you keep your mouth shut about that because you're worried about offending them or them turning against you, then there's a real loss, I think.
No, I agree. John, you had something to say and I cut you off, man. Sorry.
Oh, I was rereading the description of your book, and I came across a sentence in here that just kind of intrigues me. And it says, Paul wrestles with his position as a skeptic from his own experience and from his conversion with, sorry, I just messed up that. It says, Paul wrestles with his position as a skeptic scholar who is also a devoted yoga practitioner. And I find that interesting that you're a skeptic, but at the same time, a yoga practitioner. I mean, how has that helped you along your journey?
So I practice 6 days a week. I go at 6 a.m. and I practice until about 7:30 or 8 every day, 6 days a week. And what I'm trying to do, I'm now in my mid-50s. What I'm trying to do is to respect the pleasure of my body, respect the experience of healing that I'm feeling in my body. And that doesn't require me to leash or to cage the skeptical orientation that I fundamentally am skeptical about everything. I'm a Gen X kid. Like, I'm fundamentally suspicious of all magic. But the fact is, when I'm on that mat and I'm the type of yoga I practice is fairly physically demanding, but also meditative at the same time. So it's a very strong breathing practice. And there are moments when I'm on that mat that I am not really there, that I'm fully connected to some other reality. And normally I would roll my eyes at that. The skeptic in me would say, oh, that's just because you haven't had enough food this morning, or you're just part of this, what the French sociologist Emile Durkheim would have said, this kind of communitas, this feeling of being part of this group, kind of a mass psychology. Oh, so I would immediately, when I would previously have a kind of an elevating psychological experience, I would immediately look for explanations. Well, that's because this is just mass psychology, or this is, the fact that I didn't sleep well last night and I'm a bit hypoglycemic, or, I want to get in with this crowd because this woman's really attractive and she seems to like this kind of magical thinking or prayer or whatever. The skeptic in me would be like running after all those things and trying to, pin them down. But the practitioner part of me it's such a powerful influence on my thinking that trying to balance that, the impact of the skeptic and the impact of the experiencer, has been one of the great joys of since 2013 I've been practicing, so 12 years, and trying to keep those two things happening in my being at the same time. And not simply to say, well, when I walk into the yoga studio, I leave that skeptic in the change room. I zip it up in my bag and I go into that room and I'm this magical, 12-year-old kid. I actually try to bring both of them in there. So as I'm on the mat having these experiences, I'm aware that the kind of, I refer to Durkheim, this Emile Durkheim, this French sociologist. I'm aware that guy is in my head too, and Karl Marx is in my head, and liberation theology is in my head. All these things are in my head, encouraging me to be suspicious of all the things I'm experiencing and seeing around me, social structure and mass psychology and whatever. So I'm super aware of that, and yet at the same time, my body is doing additional things. I wouldn't even say it's doing other things. It's doing just additional things in addition to my brain saying, oh, but what about this? But what about that? Maybe it's just this. And then the other part of my being is feeding me other data, I would say. And it's all kind of, I'm trying to, as I get older, I'm trying to make space for the possibility that both of those things, the skeptic self and the practitioner self, can coexist and can even support one another. There are people in my field who say, no. When you walk into that room, you better go in there either as a total insider or as a total outsider. Go in as a critic, skeptic kind of person, trying to explain what's happening in there in terms of something else, class, race, gender, power, whatever. Or you go into that room and you forget about all other interpretations and you just soak up the experience. And I actually don't know that you have to make that choice.
Yeah. Well, it seems like maybe on a day-to-day basis, you might make different choices. I mean, there might be days when you walk in and that's exactly your experiences. I'm just going to fully surrender to this and let it be what it is.
Yeah, no, actually, that's super smart. Like, I just want to acknowledge that, how wise that is, because in a period where I'm, let's say, suffering tremendously psychologically from a conflict with my wife or with my son or with my career, or like something's really hurting and really disorienting. Yeah, I just want to go in there and as much as possible, just sort of be low and slow and deliberate and on those days when the suffering is tremendous, I might try to leash or to soften some of the voices that I hear in my head, the critical voices. But that's probably one out of every 10 days that I'm feeling very, very kind of bruised or in need of that kind of support. Most days I'm quite happy to have all the thoughts rushing through me.
Yeah, no, I am by nature very skeptical as well, and honestly, it served me well. I think I don't know. I honestly wish most of us were more skeptical about things. We might not fall for so much nonsense, by the way, which is Canadian for bullshit. That's a nice way of saying. But as I survey the landscape of my country, and I watch what's happening, if I had to boil it down to one missing ingredient, I would be, man, there is a serious lack of skepticism going on here. You decided to buy whole cloth a narrative and exclude all the other narratives. There's a lot of, and it's very, very self-serving in many ways. What I think people are going to find out, though, is that those chickens come home to roost, though. And we're seeing, sadly, I've already seen people who are lamenting, some of the things that have happened that weren't supposed to hurt them. And I can't help but wonder, why were you okay with that it was going to hurt someone else? So I'll come back to this as my way of sort of closing this out, because I know we're getting close to our time. But this idea of harm, sort of for me, as I'm wrestling with, in the absence of whatever we told ourselves was an objective moral framework, which I no longer see as objective. I'm not even sure that's possible. but I have landed in this place of, okay, what underpins my moral philosophy? And it comes down to harm. It comes down to what can I do to cause the least amount of harm for others and myself. And I evaluate everything, which is why I can take something that maybe is biblically unsound and say, "Oh, two men getting married, show me the harm." If you can show me the harm, then we can have a discussion about whether I think that's okay. If you're against this thing, this or the other, fine. Show me what actual harm trans people are doing to our world. I can guarantee you, it's very little, if any. In that case, you only care because a book told you a thing. And so, to me, that feels very in line with what I've read or what I sort of understand about more Eastern philosophies. Does that fit inside of your worldview as well? Like, hey, let's just talk about this harm reduction thing.
Sure. I mean, it's funny because the book itself actually began as a sort of a sociology, political science kind of project where I was thinking about, well, Americans are looking south of the border, or Canadians are looking south of the border at America and saying, what is happening there?
Yeah.
And so what I thought I would do is I would go to yoga spaces in Canada and then go to yoga spaces in the United States and compare and contrast the way each of those spaces looked, felt, the way people talked and all that. And I was really curious about kind of national differences, whether or not Winnipeg versus Indianapolis, for example, whether yoga would look different and sound different in these two spaces because of the really strong political differences. Because right now, Canada and the United States are kind of moving in two different directions almost entirely around women's bodies, healthcare, et cetera, and the environment. So anyway, that's what I went into the field looking for was these big political national differences around harm and the environment and women's bodies and sexuality and all that. And I kept asking people about those questions, looking for national differences. And what I kept finding instead was the concern not so much about these kinds of big macro P political, capital P political problems, but actually the concern was more about individual suffering, individual sort of soft animals, the individual bodies that were at stake. Now, those individual bodies, if they were trans bodies or African-American bodies or indigenous bodies, they had a different sense of their own precarity. They're a different sense of how endangered they are. And certainly Americans, the Americans I interviewed, certainly had a higher sense of like, we are facing big trouble now. In Canada, it's not like that. We just have a different set of political realities. But for sure, I think you're right that to identify the question around harm and trying to cause as little harm as possible as a kind of a key theme in Indic philosophy, though one also finds it in Christianity too.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just that all of these things get articulated politically, right? So right now in the American culture wars, the question about what's harmful and what's permitted and how we should make sense of trans issues or women's reproductive rights issues, these things are all getting these kind of they're all getting read through a kind of particular sort of Christian lens. In Canada, that's not really the case. That's not the dominant lens through which things are being viewed here. And so, similarly, even in India, when we think about, the Indianness of yoga, that the Indian government, which has a particular kind of, you could say, nationalist Hindutva or right-wing Hindu nationalist orientation. So the way they think about yoga is fascinatingly articulated through their understanding of Indian nationalism, right? Where they're trying to negotiate the difference between Indian and Muslim, or Hindu and Muslim Indians. So they have a different set of variables at stake there. And when I look at the American context right now, and I think about just the strange way in which the culture wars are being played out there compared to what's happening in Canada, it's really quite a different scenario. In Canada, yoga tends to be kind of an additional thing that one might do to deal with one's suffering and to deal with one's pursuit of wellness. In the United States, it does that too, but it's also a kind of healthcare. And it's also, and obviously healthcare is a kind of a threatened commodity in your country, more so than in Canada. But also it's a way of dealing with a kind of a culture that's on fire in the United States, whereas our culture isn't quite so much on fire.
Now, every bit of that makes a ton of sense to me. So I'm still skeptical, but no, I don't even know how to articulate this well. I'm looking for a yoga studio probably next week. I am intrigued by all of this because there's a there's a component of this that it speaks to me on those multiple levels of physical well-being, spiritual well-being, emotional well-being, that there's a possibility for some depths to be plumbed there.
Yeah. And finding the right one is just like finding the right church, right? You have to find the right kind of people.
It may be difficult. If
you just randomly go into a church, randomly into a church in West Texas, you might get picked up pretty quickly. Same thing with the yoga studio. So we can talk.
I would like to. Can I shoot you an email or something? I would definitely love to, because I'm intrigued. My wife has been interested for years, and I'm always like, no, I don't remember. I'm skeptical. Sometimes skepticism is just stubbornness disguised. It's like,
describe it, just disguised as rationalism.
Yeah. I'm like, wow. But anyway, I appreciate so much your book. I appreciate what you've had to say. I appreciate also your Grand Canadianness. It's always delightful to hang out with your country folk. I don't mean country folk like from the country. You know what I mean.
From my country. I understand.
Your kith and kin. It's always some of my very, very favorite people live near you in the world, and they're the best Christians I know. And I think
you're always welcome to come up here.
Well, you know what? It's hot as hell here, so I may have to. But no, very, very, from the bottom of my heart, speaking for myself, I'm going to go ahead and speak for John. Wow, that was really, really enjoyable, and exactly what I thought it would be, which was mind expanding, and as all good things do, raises more questions than provides answers, which I love, because now I've got all kinds of questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, appreciate it. We'll make sure and link to your book, obviously, in the show notes, and make sure people know how to connect with you. But unless you have anything to add, John?
No, again, just thank you for taking the time to talk with us. This has been an amazing conversation.
My pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.